I mean, it's so horrible, the stories of women being raped with broken glass bottles and with broomsticks, and it just goes on and on. People being burnt with melted plastic, for example, or burned with boiling water.
Ernst Roets is a South African activist and an author and the founder of a new think tank that seeks to promote a more sustainable political system for South Africa. He joins me to explain how over 140 race-based laws are turning the once prosperous nation into a third world country where not one government department functions properly and women and children cannot walk alone on the streets in broad daylight. Ernest, welcome to my program. I want to say that I think at the moment you're one of, if not the bravest human being walking on the planet. And I have a number of reasons for saying that. The topic you're dealing with to most people in the West is A, obscure, B, settled.
Yes.
White South Africans complaining about black South Africans, come on, give us a break. We've got other problems. So there's that sort of thing that's going on. But three, and most important of all, is that what we're witnessing in South Africa, I know for sure, having been born and raised in Africa, is it's something that's going to unfold in Europe and maybe even in America. And so for you at the tender age of 39 to want to spend your life doing this, instead of basically disappearing to Silicon Valley or Wall Street and making something of your life and pretending South Africa doesn't exist, it just makes me admire you and want to talk to you. So welcome and thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you. I have to say I'm really flattered by that compliment, especially coming from you. So, and I really admire you as well and what you've been doing, and I've been following you, and I'm really, really grateful that we're able to have this conversation.
Thank you so much. I left Africa when I was little. Well, I wasn't that little. I was 22 years old. But I kind of feel like that was little because, I don't know, with every decade we feel like we're losing 10 years of innocence, like human innocence. So I just wanted to start with laying it out for our audience. Why you are an African, and in some ways even more of an African than I am and can never be.
Well, yes, so there's some ambiguity between the terminology Western and African, because we are both the Afrikaner people. And when I say we are Western, the ambiguity lies in the fact that we don't live in the West, but we are, from a civilizational perspective, if you think
Western.
of, for example, Huntington's Clash of Civilizations.
Yes,
we are
I'm
Westerners.
a fan. Yeah.
Yes, well, so are we.
Yeah.
But then we are also African. But there's some ambiguity in that because, again, from the Huntington perspective, you could describe African identity as something like the African civilization, and in that sense, we're not African. If you mean by that sort of a cultural description, but we are African in the sense that we live in Africa. And especially our community, or I would say nation is the appropriate word, the Afrikaner nation. Yeah. We've been in Africa for hundreds of years, and we became a people in Africa to the extent that, well, we really love Africa. We love the soil, we love the weather, we love everything about Africa. Not so much the politics, but everything
I think
else.
the best way to explain it to the audiences of like Gen Z, the millennials, Gen X. I'm a Gen X. My husband is Boomer. Is just describe your family life. So you're born in where? How big is your family? Do you have siblings?
Yeah.
Do you like interact? Who do you interact with, and so on?
So my family, my direct family, of whom I directly descend, came or went to Africa in more or less 1750. That's the Roets, head of the family. Of course, he married then with someone who has been living there, so we've been in Africa for longer than that. But 1750 that's before the Declaration of Independence, so that's very long ago. And we've been there, I think I'm 10th generation, just counting from then on. And I was born in Pretoria in a family of 2 parents and 3 children. And I know the word privilege is a big buzzword nowadays, but I'm very privileged in the sense that I grew up in a healthy family with 2 parents who love each other, who still do, who are still married, and who taught us about principles and virtue and tradition and culture and so forth.
And religion.
And religion, of course, yes.
And the religion is?
Christianity.
And which denomination? Did that matter at all?
Yes, so the Afrikaner people are predominantly Protestant and also predominantly Calvinist.
Yeah.
So Reformed, you could say Dutch Reformed.
Dutch Reformed. Do you speak Dutch? Or, I mean, Afrikaner?
Yeah, Afrikaans, I understand Dutch, but it takes some time. It's not the same language. Some people in the Netherlands would say it is, but it's just a dialect.
Ik heb Afrikaners in het Nederlands gesproken met Afrikaners.
Ja.
En ze begrijpen mij en ik begrijp ze. Dus wat is het verschil? I've spoken to Afrikaner people in Dutch, and they've spoken to me in Dutch, and we understand each other. So what's the big difference other than the accent?
Yeah, there are some, like for example, you use the word begrijp. We would say verstaan.
Verstaan,
Yeah. But there are some differences in the sense that in the Afrikaans language, it predominantly came from Dutch, but we took on some other words. So we don't say feel to say a lot. We say baya. Baya is a word from Malayan origin, and we don't say what's the Dutch word for banana? Is it also banana?
It's banana.
Oh, so
because
we say
obviously
pisang.
there are no bananas.
Yeah. Okay, so
In
we
the
say
Netherlands,
pisang.
yeah.
And I've heard that some of the Dutch laugh about in Afrikaans. We are very committed to making sure that there's an Afrikaans word for every English word. So I think I heard somewhere that
So the Afrikaans language is probably richer than the Dutch language, because if you're going to account for every English word, that's going to be way more words than
I
Dutch.
think so. So I don't know if there's a Dutch word for milkshake. I think they just say milkshake.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we say melkskommel.
Geschuurde melk.
Yeah, okay. So we say melkskommel. And
het is melkskommel.
Yeah, and the one word I know Dutch people find very funny is the word for lift. We say huisbak or huisbakkie, which is, a bucket that goes up and down. But for us, that's just the word for a lift. So and it's gotten to some extreme cases where for a CD, for example, a lot of people felt we don't want to call it a CD because that's English. Mm-hmm. So they call it a compact schijf.
Yeah, that have we ook in.
You have that
in
as
Dutch,
well.
yeah, compacts, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, there are some differences and some similarities. And when I went to Amsterdam recently, I thought it was very funny that they described scooters, I think, as snorfietsen.
Yeah, snorfietsen.
Yeah. I thought that was very funny, and so there are some similarities. I think first encounter between Afrikaans and Dutch, you don't really follow that good, and then you sort of get attuned to it, and then you can follow.
Yeah. So this is, in broad terms, your background, but what about your micro life, yourself, your own early childhood? What prepared you for today, for the work you're doing? Why is it that you're not doing something else?
Yeah. Well,
it's a difficult thing to do,
Yes, it is. So there's a long answer, but I'll try to get to the medium answer, the medium length one. Firstly, as a Christian, I very much believe in the notion of calling, of being called to do something, which is a Christian concept, but it's also a Western concept, the Aristotelian view of the telos and potentiality to actuality. And so that's very much part of our tradition as well, is that you are on earth with a purpose. And you don't decide what your purpose is, you have to discover it. So that on the one hand, but in terms of my own family life, I didn't grow up in a family that was very political. They had political views, but they weren't politically involved. But they were very cultural. And so I grew up in a very religious family and we, as a child, we went to cultural camps and we spoke. And I thought that was normal. And again, this is one way in which I believe I'm very privileged, again, to use the buzzword, is in my family, we would spend time around the dinner table talking about ideas and talking about historical events and the notion why is it important to be grateful, and what would the English be? The Afrikaans word would be rentmeesterskap, stewardship.
Rentmeesterschap, yeah.
I think
Stewardship, yeah.
The idea that we are rentmeesters or stewards, that what we have is not really ours and we need to preserve it.
For the next
exactly.
generation.
And so, and I was a bit shocked later on in my life to learn that a lot of people don't grow up like that, and it's very sad.
Mm-hmm.
But I did, for which I'm very, very grateful. But other than that, the dark side was that I was born in Pretoria, the capital of South Africa, but I grew up in the north of South Africa, not too far from the Zimbabwean border.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a child, there were a few things that happened to which I don't think children should be exposed, but that was just the realities in South Africa. One was there was a very, I don't want to go into too much detail of that, but there was a very well-known rape incident in our town growing up. It was a kidnapping and a rape with people we knew. And I was very young and I didn't really understand this. And that was around, I think it was in 1994, just when the ANC took over in South Africa. And another is we lived across the street from a family who are family of a very well-known case. There was a well-known case in, I believe, 1985 in South Africa where two families were murdered by the ANC by a landmine bomb. So they would put landmines on farm roads and kill innocent people like that. And it was a farmer and his wife and his children who died in that landmine attack because they were farmers. And the ANC had a policy of targeting farmers. And we grew up across the street from the brother of this person. And so we spoke about that.
Why do the ANC target farmers? I think we need to get that kind of settled. Is it got to do with land?
It's partly has to do with land. Historically, there's also one dimension to the argument is farmers tend to be the first people you see when you cross the border. And so it was about crossing the border into South Africa, and then the farmers, in their eyes, the farmers cooperated with the police in the apartheid system. But it's also about land, and it's also about the fact that the Afrikaner people are associated with farming life. And so it's very symbolic. To be a white farmer is sort of the symbol of being an Afrikaner. And so the Afrikaners are called the Boers, and Boer means farmer.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that. But that's the other part growing up was learning about what happened in Zimbabwe with the land grabs, and seeing it in the news and knowing it's not very far from where we live, and how they just destroyed the economy in you could say in a matter of days.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was the farm murders. So I grew up in a community where there were many, many farm attacks and farm murders. And people I knew growing up were murdered, some of them very brutally, throats slit and things like that. And there was one case of a person I didn't know, but it was a family member of someone who was close to us.
And this is in the 1990s?
It was in the 90s, yes.
Yeah, because in the 1990s, if you were to watch the Western media, it was all about reconciliation and love, and it was all going to end beautifully.
Yeah.
I mentioned this in the 1980s. I was a teenager in Kenya. So East Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, we all looked up to South Africa because South Africa was the richest country. It's like America. Everybody wanted to go there. If only you could get rid of these pesky whites, or if you could only achieve some form of freedom. And so then there was this figure of Nelson Mandela. And I remember in the 80s and even early 90s, the promise was, or what Nelson Mandela represented for us was that he was able to transition South Africa from a place where vengeance threatened to destroy everything to a place of reconciliation. And there was the story of Desmond Tutu, and there were all of these exercises in reconciliation, all the way to like Bill Clinton's presidency. And I think that if you were to just focus on the media, you would say that settled it. All the Africans outside of South Africa wanted to be South Africans. And the rest of the world, and especially America and Europe, were very proud. The whites in America and Europe were very proud, all of them, of having fought against apartheid.
Yeah.
But you're saying the story is much more complicated than that.
Exactly.
Revenge started to creep in even as early as the 1990s.
Yes. And so this story I was talking about was a very, it became a well-known farm murder, and it was very brutal. It was an elderly couple who they were tied up and dragged up and down throughout the house, and eventually the husband, who's an elderly man and a farmer, he was eventually, they open up the shower nozzle on, just hot water, and they shove the shower nozzle down his throat, up into his stomach. After that, we're not sure at what point he died, but after that, they shot him with a shotgun, close range.
And this is the ANC.
It was, well, those were criminals.
Those were criminals, yeah.
But
it would have been explained away as obviously they are just justified to be angry.
Yes, and the point here, and that's the controversial part, but it's the fact that it's controversial doesn't mean it's not true, is that there were virtually no farm attacks before 1990. The one I mentioned with the landmine is one of very, very few isolated incidents where innocent people were killed on farms. There were virtually zero. But we do know the ANC, who's governing South Africa at the moment, lived in exile. They were outside of South Africa. We do know that they had a policy of targeting farmers. They explicitly said so. It was in their policy documents. In 1985, in Kabwe, they took a formal policy position. They had a conference and they decided in their what they called military operations, there's not going to be a distinction between hard and soft targets. So it's just a way of saying they can kill innocent people. And targets, they explicitly explained that farmers are targets and should be regarded as targets. And so what happened then in 1990, when they started dismantling the apartheid system, these ANC people who were up in Africa mostly came back to South Africa, and that's when the farm murder started. Now you can say it's just incidental, but if that's just incidental, you need to find a different explanation as to why did the farm murder start at the exact time when these people came back from exile, when they had an explicit policy of murdering farmers.
Yeah.
And so it really started in 1990. You can look and you can see that's when the statistics start for the farm murders.
The ANC is in exile, and they have an operating ideology. And that ideology at that time, is it accurate to say it was communist, even though they got a lot of help from the West?
Yes, but it was a blend. So they would describe, somewhat ironically, they would describe their own ideology as a blend of race, nationalism, and socialism. So essentially, it's national socialism. That's how. Then they would describe themselves as such in their policy documents. And so they are very proud to be Marxist-Leninists. But then there's a blend of Fanonianism, Frantz Fanon and.
Oh yeah, Frantz Fanon is like a murderous.
Yeah. The wretched of the earth. Yes.
Yeah.
And so so it's basically mixing Frantz Fanon with Karl Marx ideologically. That's I think the best way to describe their ideology.
At that point, even for an African like me, that I say an African like me, I grew up in Somalia. My father was Western oriented. He was in politics. He was against the Soviet Union. Yeah. And when I say he, I mean my clan, like my faction, whatever you want to call it. We were against the Soviet Union. And at that point, the way to subvert African societies was to play the clan card in Somalia, the tribal card in other parts of Africa. In South Africa, you're saying they're playing the race card, which obviously makes more sense. But you have to make it clear to your audiences, South Africa's isn't just black people and white people. It's made up of many black people.
Peoples,
right?
Yes.
Many different black peoples, tribes who hate one another and kill one another like the rest of us in Africa. And then there are the whites also who are not quite friendly to one another.
Yeah, well, we've had the Anglo-Boer War, for example, yes.
And then you have other, immigrants, Indians, other Asians. So just like, give me a picture of the ethnic makeup of South Africa, just so that we can show that it's much more complex
Yes.
than the simplistic. It's about black people demanding reparations, because that's how it's presented.
So in a certain sense, South Africa firstly is very big. It's we always say it's almost the size of Western Europe. From an American perspective, you could say it's twice the size of Texas. So it's a big country. It's bigger than France, bigger than Turkey.
90 million people?
About 60, between 60 and 70 million people. Yes.
Okay, so the same size, population-wise as Britain.
Yes. But it's very diverse in the sense. So, for example, the South African Constitution recognizes 12 official languages, and they are just within the black community, if you could say that. There are Zulus and Xhosas and Seperis and Sutus and Vendas and Tsongas, and you can just go down the list. And then there are the Khoi and the San, who are actually the people who have lived in Africa.
Native South Africans.
Yeah.
The Bushmen.
Yeah, also called the Bushmen, yes. And interesting, some people have said to me, don't use that word, but the Khoi and the San people, I know many of them prefer to be called Bushmen. That's sort of their traditional term that they prefer. So... And then there are other communities. There are Indian communities, Asian communities, Jewish communities. So it is very diverse. And then you could say, if you use Huntington's description, you could say among Western South Africans, there are, broadly speaking, two groups. There are the Afrikaners and there are the English.
The Anglos.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. But there are also others. There's also a German community and so forth. So it is a very diverse country. And what the ANC have effectively done is over the time sort of waged war against the notion of culture, saying that culture and it's a typical communist project as well. Seeing culture as something that has to be destroyed, because culture is a barrier to this ideological goal that you wish to pursue. And so they would describe culture as backwardness. And it's very ironic. So under the banner of anti-colonialism, they would demand that everyone speaks English, for example. And that became, and so the argument was that people are just, for example, black. They're not Zulus and Xhosas and so forth. And that was a way, of course, of saying, because if you add all these tribes together, then there's a black majority, and then you could compete in an election on the basis of being black and not with
the issues.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but it is a very diverse country, and I think that's part of the problem that we experience in South Africa today, is this attempt to destroy cultural diversity. And I know that's a buzzword, because diversity is actually a good thing if we recognize it for what it's supposed to be.
Well, if you insist on unity, on national unity, and you develop a narrative, and a set of ideas that lead to prosperity, that lead to peace, then you can say we can be as diverse as we can, but we have something to unite around. And it sounds as if South Africa insisted on diversity, the sort of destructive kind.
Yes, exactly. And so one way to explain it to a European audience is to say that one could think of South Africa and the South African government and the peoples living within South Africa in ways it's very comparable to Europe, the peoples or the nations living in Europe, and then the European Union sort of governing Europe. It's highly centralized. I think the problem is the South African government is probably as centralized as the European Union wants to be. And they had a slogan actually by Samora Machel in Mozambique, who said, "For the nation to prosper, the tribe must die." And so the argument was that we need to destroy cultural identities in order to get to this new. So destroy your own identity and become something new, and that then they described as the Rainbow Nation and so forth. And it sounded
great. And the logic,
great.
I know exactly what you're talking about, because you destroy the tribe. The tribe has its own language and its own vested interests, because you fight with other tribes, and then you have the clan, and then you have the family, and then the extended family, and then you have the nuclear family. And so the thing about Marxism is it goes straight to the nuclear family. It wants to, that's what it wants to destroy in the end.
Yes.
And the experiment that's been carried out in South Africa.
Yeah, exactly. So South Africa is, and that's why we always say it's not behind the West, it's ahead of the West. And I think you mentioned this in your introduction as well. That there are some things that people in the West are trying to implement that have been implemented in South Africa for some time.
Yeah.
And one of the important lessons from South Africa is actually the classical conservative conclusion that there's a difference between theory and experience. And theoretically, the South African project sounds like an incredible project. If you read the Constitution, if you read the speeches that were made during the 90s, in theory, it's fantastic. But then you have to look at real life experience and what happens in the real world, and then you find that it's two completely different stories. There's a massive gap between, legally speaking, you could say, the de jure and the de facto reality in South Africa.
Courage.media unapologetically confronts the West's hardest truths, whilst protecting individual liberty and Judeo-Christian morality. For as little as $6 a month, you can help ensure Courage.media's early success whilst also enjoying a range of exclusive benefits such as early article access, exclusive commenting, unlocking all of our podcast episodes, and more. We hope you can make Courage.media your subscription of choice today. You can also make a one-off donation. To do either of these, please click on the link in our description. Join us as we fight to protect Western civilization. Together, we can change the course of history. Yeah, and part of it has to do with America and the West winning the ideological, or thinking they won the ideological, or they actually won. I believe we won.
You mean with the Cold War?
With the Cold War, yeah. So the concept of political freedom combined with economic freedom is the winning recipe. But then as soon as the curtain fell, I think we just got distracted and started pursuing other things, whereas the true romantics, right, the ideologues, they carried on in pursuit of what they believed. So no one was controlling the ANC. The West was giving money to the ANC. The West was welcoming the ANC and empowering them and pretending that the things that they were doing and saying and still are doing and saying don't exist. And I think that's part of why we don't cover it. And so I want to go, you wrote a book about this, Kill the Boer.
Yes.
And I want to go systematically through the arguments that you make because they're very strong. And,
Thank you.
They're based on it. So we have this government, official government in South Africa, that knows about the targeting of white South African farmers for no other reason than that they're white, their skin color, and that is part of their ideological makeup. And you make a number of assertions, and the first one is, you know that the government is complicit because they are deprioritizing these attacks.
Yes.
And you say that the government consistently fails to treat farm attacks as a priority crime despite the frequency and the brutality. You contrast this with the government's targeted responses to other crimes. So if the government were to want to do something about this, they could, but they're choosing not to.
Yes.
First, describe the brutalities.
Okay, so just quickly for the viewers' sake, when you talk about other crimes, maybe I can just explain that. So, for example, rhino poaching is a big problem in South Africa. And so the government would say, we need to do something about rhino poaching. And there are many such examples. Copper cable theft is a very unique crime phenomenon. Gang-related violence, violence against women and children. And so all of these, there are unique government strategies to prevent them from happening. And when you say something like, something needs to be done about the farm murders, they would say, why are you saying that? You're a racist for saying that? Because don't you care about other people who are also attacked? Don't you care about other victims? But they wouldn't say, why are you concerned about rhinos? Why are you not concerned about elephants? And they wouldn't say that. So that's the thing about saying that we're not going to respond to farm attacks because it's just normal crime. It's just a crime phenomenon. So the brutality is really, really horrible. And I mentioned the example of the man who was killed with the shower nozzles that was stuck down his throat.
In the 1990s, but now you're saying this is happening almost on a weekly basis, daily basis.
It's happening quite a lot, yes. It's still happening. It peaked, and it's actually, in terms of the statistics, it came slightly down recently. And the reason is, I would say there's only one real reason for that, and that's because the farmers have gotten much better at defending themselves and organizing themselves. But there's virtually not a method of torture that you can think about that hasn't been applied in farm attacks.
Yeah.
I'm talking about people being dismembered, people being having to, family members like a husband having to watch his wife being raped, and children being killed, people being executed, people's eyes.
2-year-olds being raped in front of their parents,
Yes,
something like that.
There were examples
Awful,
like that.
yeah.
And I mean, it's just so atrocious.
The use of the panga.
Yes, the
The
machete.
machete,
Yes.
yeah, it's just I mean, I know it from other parts of Africa. It's happening in the DRC and
Rwanda,
it happened
they
in
used
Rwanda.
it in Rwanda. Yeah.
So this has now also made its way to South Africa, where people are just hacked to death, basically.
Yes. Yeah, it's like a machete, like a big knife. Yes.
Yeah.
That's almost the weapon of choice. And I mean, it's so horrible, the stories of women being raped with broken glass bottles and with broomsticks, and it just goes on and on. People being burnt with melted plastic, for example, or burned with boiling water. One thing that often happens is burning people with clothing irons. So they would make the iron hot and burn them. And it just goes on, burning people in general.
And sometimes these people would come, they would commit these brutalities, they wouldn't take anything.
Yes. So often they would take two things. They would take a cell phone and they would take a vehicle. But the reason why they take the cell phones is so that if people survive, they can't call the police. And then the vehicle they take and they drive a while down the road and they abandon it. Mm-hmm. So, in some cases, some items are stolen, but in many of these cases, people are tortured for hours, sometimes 5 hours, sometimes longer, and beaten with clubs and everything you can think of. And then they don't steal anything. And now the question is, why is this happening? And how can you say this is just normal crime? This is just another crime phenomenon. And what makes this even more unique, other than the high frequency at which it's happening and other than the brutality, is the fact that there are politicians actively encouraging it, actively calling for this to happen.
Yeah.
And then when you say, listen, you can't go onto a public platform and say, let's kill the Boers, when the Boers are actually being killed. So it's not a metaphor.
In a stadium full of 100,000 people shouting, kill the Boer, and everyone in South Africa knows the Boer is a white farmer.
Exactly. And then they would say, no, it's just freedom of speech, or it's just a metaphor. But is it, so if that isn't hate speech, the question is then, what is hate speech? Is there anything that could be hate speech? And I would say we're very much in favor of freedom of speech, which is fundamental. But if there is such a thing as hate speech, I would say the narrow and the appropriate definition is when you target a community based on who they are, based on their identity, and you call for people to go out and inflict harm on them, or violence and something like that, just because of who they are. And if that's not hate speech, then nothing is hate speech. And so this is really, really alarming. And then on top of all of this, we have the government saying, no, don't be too concerned about this.
I've championed and still continue to champion free speech. And I think for those of us who promote free speech, we know exactly what we mean. It is all speech. And you can hate. I don't like using the word hate speech because hate is a sentiment.
Yeah.
And so if you legislate against hate, you'll be asked to legislate against resentment and against
offensiveness,
all kinds of offensiveness, and that's not what you don't want the central government determining what you think, but incitement.
Yes, calling for people to inflict violence,
to go kill the Boer. That is an incitement. That is asking a whole group of people to go do whatever it is that they can imagine. And that, I think, leads to the machetes, because these people have no other means. They're poor. They have no other means of, they probably don't have guns, knives, whatever. So they use the machetes. And so kill the Boer is not free speech. It's incitement.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And even in the American context, where they have these very strong, freedom of speech.
First Amendment,
Yeah, the First Amendment, but they would also say, like shouting fire in a theater. There's also limits even in the American context, where you can't just call for people to be murdered. That's not free speech.
No, and in America, I think we've had these and continue to have, blacks were the victims of lynchings and of segregation and so on. So that's now a no-no. And it's not just the government telling us to do this. It is if people witness any form of racism and excluding others, people say something about it. The only thing that I notice, unfortunately, is it's become it's become fine. It's become okay now to be racist against white people. So we're not fighting universal racism. We're not saying all human beings are equal before the law. All human beings deserve respect and dignity. We're saying everybody deserves respect and dignity except the white heterosexual male.
Yeah.
Which is the ideology of the ANC, among others, the ideology of many leftist groups. That's what we're left with. It's the only racism that's allowed.
Yes, and there was
And the Jew is white.
Of course, yes. And there was a very evident regression in that sense. In the American context, there was Martin Luther King saying people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And this was celebrated, as it should be. And in the South African context, there were the reconciliatory stances taken by people like Mandela and Desmond Tutu and so forth, which was celebrated. And now the current line in the American context is that, Martin Luther King was some form of a sellout, and in the South African context that Nelson Mandela was a sellout. And so there's the same movement that a few decades ago said treat all people equally is now rejecting the idea that people should be treated equally. There should be discrimination.
I'm actually revisiting all of those things we were told as young people. We were told that the ANC was about the dignity of all people. The idea of multiculturalism was all about all groups. You revisit these things, you go and read the fine print, and you find it never was about that. In fact, if you insist on the collective, if you insist on the group, then you're setting yourself up against another group anyway.
Yep.
And you don't care about the individuals within those groups as long as you can, hide behind the group. So I think that, I don't know, I'm probably one of those people who is like, I'm still a fan of Martin Luther King, but not a fan of Nelson Mandela. I'm a fan of the fact that there was a transition of power, that it was peaceful. But definitely not a fan of what the ANC has become. The ANC must bear responsibility for what it has become. And the ANC has adopted and embraced an ideology that's not only divisive, but it is plunging South Africa into darkness.
Yes.
Blacks and whites.
And the ANC has been riding on the back of being the party of Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
And the Mandela narrative was so strong that you couldn't say anything that could even remotely be interpreted as criticism, because he became a saintly figure.
But that's also, that's... Who's a saint? Sorry. That's wrong.
Yeah. And so as a result of this, there was just zero scrutiny of anything the ANC did. When they started implementing these race laws, these obviously discriminatory race laws, the response was just, oh, remember, it's Mandela's people, so they must have a good reason for doing that.
For doing it, yeah.
And they just became more and more radical, up to the point now where they're openly, chanting "Kill the Boer," and they're openly talking about taking people's property, and they're calling on people to just leave the country and so forth. And now we had this sort of backlash now, especially with the Trump administration. And the ANC especially have gone crazy. They don't know how to deal with that because they've never been criticized. So something, and it has created a lot of turmoil in the South African context, but it's perhaps a turmoil that is necessary.
So on the corruption, you make a great point in your book where you're saying it's the government promises, like they say they're anti-corruption, but actually they're directly involved in corruption. You say that members of the government officials, the South African police, SAPS, and they've been directly involved in planning and executing some of these attacks. And you support your claim with victim accounts and reports of police corruption or active participation in crimes against farmers. How does that work?
Yes, so there are different sides to this. There's another dimension also, which is farm attackers mysteriously disappearing from police custody. There have been such cases. They would be in jail, and then the one day they just wouldn't be there anymore, which have been well reported. And then there's a very, very serious problem in South Africa with criminality within the police. So thousands of convicted rapists who are police officers in South Africa and so forth. People who have committed murder, people who have committed sexual offences, robbery and so forth. But they are police officers.
Yeah.
And this came to the fore at a certain point, and especially opposition parties in parliament were saying you should do something about this. And then several months after, and I believe a year after even, it came to the fore that nothing happened. Those people are still there. And there have been reported cases of police officers being involved. And there are many cases where certain evidence came to the fore, or at least preliminary evidence of police involvement. One of the best-known cases in South Africa was the story of Brendan Horner, who was a young farm manager who was murdered, I believe, in 2021 in a particularly gruesome way. He was strung up at a pole at the farm gate, and there was a message left and so forth. And it came to the fore quite compelling evidence that there were police officers involved with this murder. And eventually the case just sort of disappeared, and there still hasn't been justice for
And
this person.
the policemen have never been caught.
No.
They will never come to justice.
No.
They'll probably be promoted up the ANC.
Yep. Yes, exactly. And it's not so. That's the problem with police officers. But then if you go up higher up in the hierarchy, an even deeper rooted problem is just serious criminality within the South African government, and corruption and so forth. And it has become there's an interesting debate in South Africa about how to describe the ANC today. Could you say it is a Marxist-Leninist movement committed to, communist principles, or has that changed? Is it now just a parasitic movement that is trying to hold on to power as much as they can because the state coffers have been sucked dry largely, and they don't want to lose power, so they're just trying to hold on? And I think that's true to an extent, that they've lost much of their ideological depth, if you can describe socialism as ideological depth, but at least the extent to which they spoke about ideological goals and so forth, much of this has sort of withered away. Yeah. They're just trying to hold on to power as long as they can.
And the way to hold on to power is by insisting on race.
Yes, and scapegoating and blame shifting, and making sure that there's always a scapegoat that has to be blamed for everything that goes wrong, and then do that on a racial basis, of course.
And that then brings me to the media, which is, and you say in your book, the media itself is also complicit in biased reporting. They engage in the vilifying of these farmers. They downplay the attacks, and they discourage government intervention and public sympathy.
Yes.
So is what you are saying essentially that the journalist is no better than the policeman? Is that what it boils down to?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So you can measure that qualitatively and quantitatively. Qualitatively, just by looking at particular cases, how the media responds, and how you so often find people blaming the victims.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, the farmers should not complain about the fact that they are being murdered because look at inequality and how much are they paying their workers, or maybe they're not treating them properly. So instinctively blaming the victim and defending or trying to justify the actions of the perpetrator. And those cases happen over and over again. One case I remember was there was especially these fake news stories that come out, and then like a week after or a few days after, it revealed that the story was false. And so there was a story that came out about a farmer near Krugersdorp, which is close to Pretoria, that murdered a farm worker. And it was massive news, headlines everywhere. It was the big story of the week.
But it wasn't true.
And then it turns out that it wasn't true. It was, I believe it was someone who was killed by a security guard, someone that was invading the farm. And then when the real story came out, the story just disappeared. No one was interested in talking about this anymore. But quantitatively, and that's even more alarming, when we wrote the book, we did a study. We took every incident of violence on a farm in South Africa that we could find over years, minor incidents, major incidents, everything that we could find. And we had to appoint someone to go and do this on a full-time basis, look at throughout news reports, and we had built this one big database. And then we also looked, got as much detail of every incident that we could, like who were the victims, the perpetrators, when did it happen, where did it happen, racial demographics and so forth. And then one of the questions was also, how did the media respond? So we would add all the media reports, not just the amount of media reports, but also the media sentiment to particular cases. And then the interesting question we tried to answer was, could we identify the variables that determine how the media responds to these cases? And I initially thought the single biggest variable is the race of the victim. And it turns out that wasn't true. The biggest variable is the race of the perpetrator. So if the perpetrator is a white person, if there's if something happens on a farm in South Africa and the perpetrator is white, it's not just national, it's an international news story. You would see it on CNN and people talk about the racist white farmers, even though statistically it's marginal, the cases where it happens. If you look how many such cases have there been, but if the perpetrator is black, it's not a story. People don't report on it. And we then counted and we said the cases, if you measure up the cases where the perpetrator is white and the victim is black, and you compare that to the cases where the perpetrator is black and the victim is white, and you look at how the media responds, where the perpetrator is white and the victim is black, the media, especially the English-speaking media, report on that 16 times as much as when it's the other way around. And then at some point you have to ask the question, at what point could you say that the media is complicit to the problem in creating a particular narrative that is disconnected from the truth?
And just refusing to report. I mean, I don't know if this is going to make you feel any better, but it's the exact same thing in the United States of America, and in Britain, in the whole Anglo-Saxon world. It is exactly as you said. If the perpetrator is white, if there's a white rapist, my goodness, the whole world will know.
Yeah.
But if for that one white rapist there are 100 black or colored or Muslim rapists, no one. In fact, we'll excuse it. We'll say things like, he didn't know, or the culture, or this, and then get off from the courts.
Yeah. I think the lesson from South Africa in this regard is some people seem to think that will change once white people become a minority. And it doesn't change. When demographics change, this doesn't change. In fact, it becomes worse. The blame shifting and the scapegoating and so forth is even worse in the South African context, because now the argument is very similar to the argument in Nazi Germany back then. It's this is a minority, the Jews in that case, that have disproportionate wealth or disproportionate power, and that's why they should be targeted. And when we target them, it's justifiable. So when white people become a minority, that doesn't go away. It becomes worse.
It becomes worse because it's two wrong assumptions. Wrong assumption number one, of course, is racism or whatever, excluding other human beings on the basis of some prejudice or the other, is a human condition. It's not a white condition, but it's always been marketed as a white condition.
Yes.
And the second wrong assumption is, of course, the Marxist assumption that people are poor because the individuals who don't have something because someone else
they
has it. That's zero sum.
Yes. And if you have something, it's because you stole it. By definition.
So
then in South
and
Africa,
you can only have something by taking it away from not by producing, growing, changing.
Yeah. And then in the South African context, and it's happening in much of the Western world as well, is they mix that then with race nationalism. So they would equate being poor to being black.
Yeah.
And in as far as black people are wealthy, they would deny that that's happening. And in as far as white people are poor, in South Africa, we have white squatter camps.
Yeah.
But no one wants to talk about the white squatter camps in South Africa because it doesn't fit the narrative, and so it should just be ignored.
Tell me a little bit about the white squatter camps.
So there are actually many. One number I've heard is in the Pretoria area alone, there are about 80 white squatter camps. And there have been big debates on how to calculate white poverty and so forth in South Africa. It is a very serious problem. And it's partly or largely because of racial exclusion. So if you are white, then you are, according to the legal system in South Africa, with the more than 140 race laws, that means by definition you are privileged or you are advantaged and you have to be discriminated against, even if you grew up in a squatter camp. And if you are black, then by definition that means you are disadvantaged, even if you are the son of a billionaire or the son of the president.
Yes.
And so, but you don't see the white squatter camps as much if you travel throughout South Africa, because the black squatter camps are often you would find them next to the highway, or they would be very much in the open. And they would have government support. Government would install electricity and so forth. But the white squatter camps, you would often find them on private property. So it would be someone's farm, or someone has a small holding, and then there would be just a group of people who don't have homes or work, and then they would start squatting there, or they would say to these people, you can come and live here. But it is a problem. It certainly is a problem, and it's a growing problem. And there have been, I'm happy to see that there have been some recently Europeans and Americans traveling to South Africa to investigate this particular issue.
To take an interest in this,
and I hope that more people can report on that, because it is a growing problem.
We have to keep talking about it. And maybe in your documentary making, you've got to film it. So we need to see visuals of this.
Yes.
My friend and colleague whom I admire very much, Charles Murray, had written this book on the unmaking of America, the uncoming of Africa. And it was just about poor white people making almost the exact same decisions that black communities made a few years ago, with the same outcomes.
Yeah.
So it really doesn't matter. It's not about the color.
Yes.
Yeah, it's about
Thomas Sowell has also written.
Thomas Sowell. So Thomas Sowell is my hero, as opposed to Nelson Mandela, because it's about ideas, isn't it? It is appreciating the ideas that lead to the right outcomes, or the desirable outcomes, versus the ideas that lead to the undesirable outcomes. And so cultivating these narratives about, that are all based on grievances, whether they are economic grievances or racial grievances, they just lead to the same thing. They just lead to more destruction.
Yes.
More misery.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so Sowell and many others have done the same, but from different perspectives. But Sowell, he's written many books, but one of the great books I think he wrote that is not a very well-known book is in the 80s. He wrote a book called The Economics and Politics of Race.
Yes.
And I always say the book would be more aptly titled The Economics and Politics of Culture, because it's not so much about race, it's more about culture.
It's about,
but he went throughout the world and he looked at groups that have been targeted through discriminatory practices, whether it's Southeast Asia, whether it's Europe, America, Africa, and then the question was, what happened to these people? Did they become wealthy or not? If they did, why?
Yeah.
And his main conclusion was that he couldn't find a single example anywhere in the world throughout history of a group of people or a community that rose from poverty to affluence as a result of politics. Some law that is implemented, and then these people become wealthy. It's always because of, he says it's three things. It's a combination of work ethic, hard work, combined with skills development, combined with savings, not spending more than you earn.
So Calvinism, in short. So on this subject of Calvinism, I was born in Somalia, Muslim country, and then in these Muslim households and amongst Muslim communities.
Yeah.
And when I came to Europe and I found out about Calvinism and the way it leads to wealth and stability and prosperity, I know there are other problems.
Yeah.
But just on a large scale, these three things that Thomas Sowell picked out, regardless of where you apply them in the world, they do lead to prosperity and stability. The Afrikaners were in South Africa, as you say, for hundreds of years. Is there any of that value system that they have shared with or imparted on Black Africans in South Africa? And when I say black, I don't use the word black the way the communists use it, but it's among the Zulu, among which tribe or the other. For instance, I can tell you the rich tribes in different parts of Africa that have adopted that, but they're just not big.
So that's a complex question to answer. In a certain sense, there's a very fascinating study that was done in the 1990s when the ANC started implementing these race laws. They called it Black Economic Empowerment, which is the South African version of DEI. And it's not empowerment at all.
Yeah.
It's just making black people dependent on the South African government through social grants and so forth. And a study came out, and according to these laws, when they were implemented, it forced businesses to start implementing as they called it, or still do, they call it transformation policies. And one study that was done at the time found that when that law was implemented, before that, already 90% of businesses had such programs of including people and training them because they wanted to.
Yeah.
And it really is a reality, and it's contrary to the narrative. I mean, I grew up in a farming community in South Africa. It really happens in the farming communities where the white commercial farmers are almost all of them involved in some way with some community upliftment project, helping aspiring black farmers, to training them and sharing expertise. And you find that all over South Africa. But those in power wouldn't admit that because they would want to say the only way to get to that is through the government and through the state.
So let's set aside DEI and BEE, Black Empowerment Economics. But just in terms of, I'm even thinking of Christianity, right?
Yeah.
If you look at Christian Africa and Muslim Africa, sometimes the economics is not that different from one another. But Christian Africa is more peaceful.
Yeah.
It's just not, Christian individuals, regardless of their skin color, are not planning a mission of violence. And so looking at the violence that's going on in Africa right now, like the perpetrators, the people who are going to these farms, what would you say is their religion, and why is Christianity not a factor there?
So, if you look at opinion surveys in South Africa, they would say that South Africa is 80% Christian. Now, there are different, Christian could mean different things.
Yes, I found that out, yeah.
Yes. Sorry. And I would be very hesitant as a Christian to declare if someone else is a Christian or isn't a Christian. But what we do have in much of Africa, but especially in South Africa, is some form of a blend of Christianity with ancestral worship and cultural practices. And I'm not always sure where culture ends and where religion begins. But what's interesting and unfortunate about South Africa is, I think you're right to say that African nations or communities are generally, or Christian nations or communities are generally more peaceful. But South Africa seems to be the exception in the sense that South Africa is an extremely violent country. And I've traveled a bit through Africa. I've had some, I've went up to Botswana, Zambia, Zimbabwe even.
Kenya.
Kenya, Tanzania and so forth.
Tanzania, there.
And then I have to be honest with you. So the Limpopo River is the northern border of South Africa, but when you cross the Limpopo River from coming in from South Africa, you feel safer. So I feel when you go into Africa, you feel safer than you do in South Africa.
Yeah.
And it's not just a personal experience. I've spoken in all these sub-Saharan African countries with, locals you meet and engage with, and you talk about where you're from and so forth. And I would always ask people about South Africa, and the general view I got was that people in these other sub-Saharan countries are very concerned about what's happening in South Africa. And I would ask people, why don't you move to South Africa? And I know a lot of people are, but then some other people would say that they can't move there, it's just too dangerous.
Yeah.
And so the violence in South Africa is not comparable to the violence in Zimbabwe was largely political through the state. But other than that, the violence just on ground level in South Africa is not comparable to Botswana or Malawi or Zambia or Kenya or Tanzania.
Yeah.
And I think there's maybe some part of the reason was that, again, the ANC back in the 80s and 90s actively encouraged violence.
Yeah.
They actively wanted violence in the townships, and they called it a people's war strategy back then. And it was partly influenced by Mao Zedong and lessons they learned from Vietnam and so forth. And there's a fascinating history about that. But we do have that. We have a very serious problem of violence in South Africa, regardless of religion.
They wanted a revolution, and they have it, and you're living through the revolution.
Yes.
And it's not, it could have been predicted by anybody who understands these socialist revolutions. They always turn out to be people-hating and violent and obscene in their violence and destructive. And it'll be destructive and is destructive to whites, blacks, anybody it touches, it scorches.
Yeah. Can I say something about that? Hannah Arendt, in a certain sense, you could say, predicted what would happen in South Africa.
Yes.
Because in On Revolution, she talks about revolutionary movements and the tendency to become corrupt and to eventually destroy society. And there's some reasons why she says that happens. Is initially, when a revolutionary movement takes power, initially it goes okay. There's usually some form of an era of stability for a while, and we had that in South Africa. And then things start to fall apart. And she sort of speculates why this happens. And one reason she says is when they take power, initially at least, the goal, the sort of the vibe, you could say, is let's make this work. But that's not the nature of a revolutionary movement. A revolutionary movement wants to destroy something. It doesn't want to build something. And the other reason, she says, is in many of these cases, people need to learn the system. How does the system work, and how can you be corrupt? Where can you steal, and how can you get away with it? And so her prediction is that in almost all cases, when a revolutionary movement takes power, eventually it leads to corruption and it leads to a deterioration of society. And she has a theoretical explanation, but you can see that happening in a country like South Africa. It's a perfect example.
Yeah, you get the tyranny and then you get the anarchy.
Yes.
And it's inescapable, whether it was Cambodia or Venezuela or South Africa or Somalia.
Or Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and
Cuba.
We want to try it in New York right now, but it's going to lead to the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no single example of where this has worked.
Yeah, but we keep believing in it. We want to try, let's try it here. So final question for you, because we're running out of time.
That's fine, yes.
So one question is, how can we fix it? Like, do you think there's a way back for South Africa to find actual stability, actual prosperity, actual racial harmony, and a harmony between all the different peoples and tribes that live in South Africa? Or is it going to be another Somalia?
Yeah, I think so. I recently started a new initiative called Lex Libertas, Latin, for law and freedom, and it's a combination of a think tank and a pressure group, and it works towards achieving what we call a more sustainable political dispensation for South Africa. And our argument is that South Africa, the crises that people see in South Africa, such as crime and unemployment and so forth, are not really the crises themselves, but actually symptoms of a deeper rooted problem.
Yeah.
And the question is, how do we fix that? And in a certain sense, I would say that the solution lies on a micro-political and a macro-political level. So unfortunately, there's not a quick fix.
Yeah.
But when I say micro-political, I mean that certain policy changes have to happen, within the system that we have.
Yeah.
We need to promote, a free market. Property rights have to be protected. Things could be done to address the farm killings, to address politicians chanting about murdering people and so forth. But these are solutions within the political system, and I would argue that much of the problems that we face in South Africa are a result of the political system. And in theory, again, it's a good system. If you read the South African Constitution, it's great. But then if you look at what's happening, it's something completely different. And part of the reason for that is because those in power have a different lens through which they interpret the Constitution. They interpret it through a fundamentally anti-Western, black nationalist, socialist lens.
Yeah.
And so when the Constitution says you can expropriate property when it's in the public interest, they have a complete different view of what is public interest. And so the macro-political solution that we need to work towards is a system that is decentralized and a system based on the principles of autonomy and self-governance. Because like I said, South Africa is big and it's very diverse. And no one in South Africa actually has self-governance. We have this big central government that is detached from everyone. It's an oligarchy, you could say.
Yeah.
And so our goal is to work towards a better political system for South Africa. Now that's, as Jim Collins would say, a big, hairy, audacious goal.
Yeah.
But I think it's a goal worth pursuing. And I think at least we are now at the point where people are starting to recognize the problem. So we're making progress in that sense.
Yeah.
But what we need now is for people to increasingly speak out about at least supporting those who are trying to get to some form of a sustainable solution.
And then the final question is, given all that we've talked about and all that you know about South Africa and all your work, what would be the advice that you would give to Americans and Europeans and other Westerners who are seeking the politics of socialism, communism, Maoism, racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-Zionism? What would you say to us?
All of those things you mentioned are based on the idea that we would achieve a better world once we destroy something. So there is something that needs to be destroyed. There is something that we despise, and our ideology or our political project is based on ensuring that this thing is destroyed. And then the assumption is always that some phoenix would rise from the ashes. But these ideologies and these projects never really talk about building. They never really talk about what should be done once the destruction is complete. It's always just this assumption that something great would happen after we've finished with destroying things. And I think some people are so drunk on ideology that you will never convince them. But I hope that people who are at least interested in having an honest conversation and who are interested in reason and rational thought would recognize that an ideology or a political program that only seeks to destroy something cannot be sustainable. It cannot lead to growth. It can only lead to destruction.
Yeah.
And so, but a program that is built on the idea of building something and preserving something and protecting something, or, you know, as we say in Western philosophy, preserving the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Yes.
That is something that can actually lead to something that is worth cherishing. But I'm very concerned, especially living in South Africa and experiencing these things that have been spoken about for some decades in the South African context, now seeing that people in the Northern Hemisphere are very eager to implement the same things that have been implemented in South Africa. And so, again, maybe somewhat philosophical, I think people should read Edmund Burke.
Yep.
And Burke, who said that value experience over theory. And I think that's one of the core messages from South Africa is theory is great and you can have a wonderful theory, but the question is, does it work?
Yeah.
Does it work in reality? And what can we learn from what has happened in the world? And in that sense, that's once again is why I believe South Africa is ahead and not behind. And I really hope that people in the West and other parts of the world would look at South Africa and also learn from the mistakes that have been implemented in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the work you do.
Thank you. Well, thank you for you also for standing up, and it's a great privilege to speak with you.
Thank you. And we'll keep talking about South Africa because I agree with you. Zero sum will lead to zero. It's always going to be the sum.
That's exactly it, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, yeah.